"I'm busy. Handle it yourself," said the millionaire CEO. 3 years later, he saw her with twins, and what happened next will shock you. A very beautiful story for my loyal, greatest and best family. Let's begin with love. Before we start, I just want one thing from you. Type present in the comments. Jay Underhill built his kingdom on ashes. The penthouse reflected his philosophy: steel, glass, and nothing soft enough to break. Success tasted like expensive whiskey and felt like absolute control, yet somehow both left him hollow. He owned companies that employed thousands, lived in a tower that scraped clouds, and slept alone in a bed, big enough for a family he'd never have. The foster system taught him everything he needed to know about survival. When his parents abandoned him to run from their crimes, leaving him with social workers and strangers, something inside calcified into stone. Love became a liability. Trust became foolishness. The only reliable thing in this world was what he could build with his own hands, what he could control with his own will. Attachments led to abandonment. Caring led to betrayal. Better to need nothing and no one. He'd clawed his way up from nothing, sleeping in his car during early startup days, eating ramen while coding through nights, building something from the wreckage of his childhood. Every success felt like revenge against parents who taught him that family meant lies and love meant running when things got hard. He'd proven he didn't need them, didn't need anyone, could survive and thrive completely alone. Tara Allen walked into his life during a thunderstorm, carrying blueprints and wearing rain-soaked confidence. She'd been hired as a junior architect for his new headquarters, fresh from graduate school, with a portfolio that impressed even his harshest critics. Her designs had soul, something his buildings typically lacked. Where he demanded sharp angles and intimidating height, she sketched spaces that breathed, that welcomed, that felt human. Their first meeting lasted hours. She challenged every cold decision, questioned every sterile choice, pushed back when others simply nodded. He found himself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in memory. When she left that night, his office felt emptier than before. He caught himself thinking about her later, wondering what she thought of him, hoping she'd return. The relationship built slowly, carefully. Late meetings turned into dinners where they talked about everything except work. Professional respect bloomed into something neither expected. She saw past the armor, recognized the wounds underneath, and somehow didn't run. She told him about her grandmother who raised her, about putting herself through school waiting tables, about believing people deserved spaces that felt like hope instead of intimidation. He told her things he'd never spoken aloud, about the social workers who shuffled him between houses like unwanted furniture, about learning that attachments only led to abandonment, that caring was just another word for eventual pain, about building walls so high nothing could hurt him again, then realizing he'd locked himself inside where nothing could reach him either. She kissed him first, on a rooftop under city lights, and whispered that broken things could be repaired if someone cared enough to try. He wanted to believe her. Some desperate part of him, buried under layers of self-protection, wanted to believe that maybe he wasn't too damaged for this. Maybe he could learn to be something other than alone. Months passed, like a dream he kept expecting to end. She moved into the penthouse, brought warmth to the cold spaces, left books on his nightstand and music in his silence. His colleagues noticed the change. He smiled more, raged less, seemed almost human. She was remaking him without even trying, just by existing beside him, by showing him what life could feel like when shared with someone who actually cared. He'd watch her sometimes when she didn't know, the way she hummed while making coffee, the way she smiled at strangers in elevators, the way she touched his arm when making a point, casual affection he'd never experienced before. Small gestures that meant everything to someone who'd grown up with nothing. Terror was remaking his understanding of what mattered. Buildings stopped being trophies to collect. Work stopped being the only thing that defined him. He started leaving the office earlier, started saying no to weekend obligations, started protecting time with her like it was more valuable than any contract. And it was. She was teaching him without lecturing, showing him through example that success without connection was just expensive loneliness. Then came the morning she stood in his bathroom, staring at a positive pregnancy test with shaking hands. Terror and hope warred in her chest. They'd never discussed children. He'd made comments about never wanting to repeat his parents' mistakes, about not understanding how to be a father when he'd barely had one, about fearing he'd damage any child. He tried to raise because damage was all he knew how to create. But maybe this could be different. Maybe they could build something better together. Maybe his past didn't have to determine their future. She wanted to believe that. Needed to believe it. She practiced the words all morning, found courage in her grandmother's voice echoing in memory. "You don't know until you try, baby girl." Made the appointment, got confirmation from a doctor who smiled and said congratulations, bought a card with tiny footprints on the front, wrote a letter inside about hope and futures and building something beautiful together, poured her heart onto paper, trying to find words that would make him see possibility instead of fear. She walked into his office just after lunch, heart hammering against her ribs. He was behind his desk, phone pressed to one ear, another call on hold, papers scattered everywhere. His face was twisted in fury, veins prominent in his neck. The crisis he'd been fighting had reached its critical moment. Everything he'd built over years was balanced on the edge of a knife, threatening to collapse if he made one wrong move. She tried to wait. Stood in the doorway holding the card, trying to catch his eye, but he was screaming into the phone about legal options and emergency responses. His fist slammed against the desk hard enough to rattle everything on it, scattering papers that drifted to the floor like surrendered flags. She cleared her throat. He glanced up, face still contorted with rage, and made a violent gesture for her to leave. The gesture was dismissive, like swatting away an insect, like she was nothing more than an interruption to something actually important. "I need to tell you something," she managed, voice small against his storm. He covered the phone with one hand, eyes blazing with impatience and fury. "I'm busy. Handle it yourself." The words hit like a physical blow. He turned away immediately, already back in his conversation, dismissing her existence. She stood frozen, the card crumpling slightly in her grip. Waited for him to look back, to remember who she was, to see that this mattered. But he'd already forgotten she was there, already moved on to the next problem, the next crisis, the next thing that demanded his attention. She walked out. Her legs felt disconnected from her body. The elevator ride down felt like falling. She sat in her car in the parking garage and cried until her throat was raw, mascara running in black rivers down her face, then drove to the small apartment she'd kept but never used, the safety net she'd maintained because some part of her always knew this day would come. That night, she packed everything she owned into boxes, wrote him a letter that took hours and a dozen drafts, explaining everything, the pregnancy, the twins, the doctor mentioned almost casually during the ultrasound, her plan to raise them, with or without him, her desperate hope that he'd choose to be part of this. She poured her heart onto paper, then sealed it before courage failed. He spent that night in his office, winning his war. The crisis was resolved. His companies stood secure. He drank victory champagne that tasted like ashes and thought about apologizing tomorrow. Pride kept him from calling, from texting, from walking down to where she slept in the penthouse. Tomorrow would be soon enough. She'd understand. She always understood. That's what he told himself while staring at the phone, while typing apologies. He never sent, while convincing himself that work came first because without work he had nothing. Tomorrow came, but she was already gone. Her apartment cleaned out, her phone disconnected, her existence erased like she'd never been there at all. The penthouse felt cavernous without her things, without her warmth, without her. He told himself it was temporary. She just needed space. She'd come back when she was ready. People didn't just disappear. They came back. They always came back. But days became weeks, and weeks revealed the truth. She'd left the letter with his secretary, a nervous woman who tucked it in a desk drawer during the chaos, planning to give it to him when he calmed down, when things weren't so urgent. Then she got fired for an unrelated mistake, packed her belongings in a panic, and the envelope got swept into a box that ended up forgotten in a storage unit across town, where it would sit untouched and unread for years. He searched everywhere, hired investigators who found nothing, called everyone who might know her, but she'd been careful, deliberate in her disappearance. The landlord of her old apartment mentioned she'd paid to break her lease early, seemed upset, wouldn't say where she was going. That was all anyone knew. She'd vanished like smoke, leaving no trace, no trail, nothing to follow, standing in the empty penthouse, staring at the space where her books used to live. Jay Underhill finally understood what he'd lost. Not just a woman, not just a relationship, but the only chance he'd ever have at becoming someone better than the broken thing his parents created. The only person who'd ever looked at him and seen something worth saving. He won the war and lost everything that mattered. The champagne went flat, the victory felt hollow, and the silence in the penthouse was so complete it became a physical presence, a weight pressing down on everything, reminding him constantly that he was alone again, and this time it was entirely his fault. Chapter 2. The Silence Between. Tara sat on a Greyhound bus watching the city disappear behind her, one hand pressed against her stomach where two hearts beat beneath her own. The letter felt like a weight in her purse, already delivered, already beyond recall. She'd handed it to the secretary with trembling fingers, watched the woman promise to give it to him right away, and walked out before doubt could stop her, before she could convince herself to stay and try again, before she could make excuses for behavior that had no excuse. Her grandmother's house waited 3 states away, empty since the funeral last year, left to Tara in a will that felt like prophecy now. The small town she'd visited during childhood summers now represented salvation. Nobody there knew about Jay Underhill or his empire. Nobody would ask questions she couldn't answer. Nobody would judge her for being alone and pregnant and terrified. The bus ride took forever. Every mile felt like distance between her old life and whatever came next. She watched farmland replace buildings, watched sky expand as cities shrank, watched everything familiar disappear behind her until she was surrounded by landscape she barely recognized. Starting over. That's what this was. Complete erasure of everything she'd built, everyone she'd known, the life she'd constructed in the city. The house smelled like time and memories when she finally arrived. Floral wallpaper, creaky floors, a porch that faced sunrise. She unpacked her life into rooms that remembered simpler versions of herself, before cities and penthouses and men who chose everything except her. The silence was different here. Not oppressive like the penthouse when he was gone, but peaceful. Empty in a way that felt like possibility instead of abandonment. The pregnancy was difficult from the start. Morning sickness that lasted all day, every day. A body growing 2 humans instead of 1, struggling under the weight and demands. Nights alone, wondering if he'd gotten the letter, if he'd chosen not to respond, if his silence was its own answer. She stopped checking her phone after the first month when it became clear no call was coming. Hope was more painful than acceptance. Better to move forward than wait for someone who'd made it clear she didn't matter. She found work at the Copper Kettle, a cafe that hired her despite obvious pregnancy, where the owner was a sharp-tongued woman named Birdie, who asked no questions and accepted no excuses. The work was honest and exhausting, perfect for someone trying not to think. Perfect for filling hours that would otherwise be spent wondering what if. Birdie became the first friend she made in town. Older woman with grey hair and sharp eyes who saw everything and judged nothing. She taught Tara the rhythms of cafe work, introduced her to regulars, protected her from customers who got too curious about personal details. Never asked about the father, never pressed for information Tara wasn't ready to share. Just accepted what was offered and let the rest remain private. The twins arrived during a snowstorm, early but healthy, screaming their arrival into the world with identical fury. Tiger came first, loud and demanding, already pushing against the world. George followed quieter, thoughtful even as a newborn, observing before reacting. She held them both and felt something shift inside, some fundamental reordering of what mattered. These boys would never doubt they were wanted, would never wonder if they were enough, would never feel abandoned by someone who was supposed to love them. She named them after her grandfather and great-uncle, men who'd stayed when staying was hard, who'd loved without conditions, who'd showed up every single day. The birth certificates had a blank space where father's name belonged. She left it empty, let him be a ghost. Let them have the safety of not knowing someone chose to leave before they were born. Tara's life became small and deliberate. The cafe job covered basics. Night classes in web design offered hope of better income eventually. Birdie babysat when needed, refusing payment, just helping because that's what people did in small towns. Neighbors dropped off hand-me-down clothes and barely used baby equipment. The community absorbed her slowly, carefully, offering support without demanding explanations. The boys grew in a house filled with love, if not luxury, learning that happiness didn't require wealth, that presence mattered more than presence, that their mother would move mountains for them, even if mountains were all she had to give. Tiger became a force of nature, loud, fearless, constantly testing boundaries. George was his opposite, quiet, thoughtful, cautious. They were different but inseparable, completing each other in ways that made her heart ache with how much they reminded her of what family could be. She dated once, a mechanic named Curtis who was kind and steady, who didn't flinch at her having children, who proposed after months of patient courtship. She tried to say yes, wanted to say yes, needed to believe she could move forward, could build something with someone who actually showed up. But standing there with his hopeful face and simple ring, all she could see was grey eyes and unanswered questions. All she could feel was the ghost of someone who dismissed her existence with 4 careless words. She said no, as gently as possible, watched him drive away, and cried on her porch while the twins slept inside. Some ghosts refused to be buried no matter how deep you tried to dig. Some wounds stayed tender no matter how much time passed. Some part of her was still standing in that office holding a card, still waiting for him to look at her like she mattered. Meanwhile, in a storage unit across town from the penthouse, a box sat gathering dust. Inside, beneath old files and forgotten paperwork, an envelope waited with Tara's handwriting on the front. The secretary who'd tucked it away had moved on, started fresh somewhere new, completely forgotten about the letter that could have changed everything. The letter that explained everything. The letter that would sit unread while 2 lives diverged and 2 children grew without their father knowing they existed. Years dissolved like sugar in rain. Tara's walls grew higher, her heart more guarded. She'd loved once with everything she had, been dismissed with 4 careless words, and learned the lesson. Safety lived in smallness, in keeping expectations low and circles tight, in never again giving someone the power to destroy her. She was content if not happy, surviving if not thriving, building a life that fit inside the boundaries of what she could control. The twins were everything. Her job was stable. Her friends were real. The town was home now. She'd created something from nothing, proved she didn't need him, showed her sons that strength looked like showing up every day, even when everything was hard. But sometimes, late at night, after the boys were asleep and the house was quiet, she'd stand at the window and wonder if he ever thought about her, wonder if he'd tried to find her, wonder if those 4 words haunted him the way they haunted her. Wonder if some part of him ever regretted choosing his work over her. She'd never know. That chapter was closed. The book was finished. Life moved forward because that's what life did. It continued whether you were ready or not, whether you'd healed or not, whether you'd forgiven or not. And she'd built something good from the ruins. Her boys were proof that endings could become beginnings if you were brave enough to start over. Neither of them knew that everything was about to change. Neither of them knew that fate had a different plan. Neither of them knew that a broken-down car on a rainy backroad would shatter the careful distance they'd built, would force them to face what they'd both been running from, would prove that some stories refuse to end until they're properly finished. The silence between them had lasted years. It was about to break. Chapter 3. Monuments to Ghosts. Jay Underhill transformed into something unrecognizable over the years that followed. The man who'd fought for every dollar now signed contracts without reading them. The leader who'd terrorized people with his intensity now sat through meetings staring at nothing. Success accumulated around him like snow, beautiful, cold, meaningless. Everything he touched turned to gold, but gold couldn't fill the emptiness. His wealth multiplied beyond reason. Magazine covers featured his face, alongside words like visionary and unstoppable. Industry awards collected dust on shelves he never looked at. He attended galas where people competed for his attention, gave speeches about determination and vision, accepted accolades that felt increasingly hollow. Everything he'd spent years building had finally arrived, and it felt like standing in an empty room, shouting at walls that didn't echo back. The penthouse remained exactly as she'd left it. He couldn't bring himself to change anything, to erase the ghost of her presence. Sometimes, late at night, he'd swear he heard her humming in the kitchen, smell her perfume in the bedroom, feel her warmth beside him before remembering she was gone. Her books still sat on the shelf. Her coffee mug still hung in the cabinet, small artifacts of a life they'd shared that ended because of his cruelty. His assistant scheduled everything. Meals delivered, clothes selected, life managed from a distance by people paid to care. He moved through days like a ghost haunting. His own existence, present but not really there, breathing but not quite alive. Work continued because work always continued, but the passion had evaporated, leaving only mechanical execution of tasks that no longer held meaning. The donations became his only genuine action. He created foundations with carefully chosen names, funded programs that would have made her smile, built institutions that served the vulnerable. Every charitable decision was a prayer she'd never hear, an apology she'd never receive, an attempt to become someone worthy of what he'd lost. Money poured out toward causes that might somehow reach her, might somehow say what he couldn't. That he was sorry, that he'd failed, that she deserved better than what he'd given. The scholarship, named after her middle name, grew into a full program supporting single mothers through college. He attended the annual ceremony once, watched women accept awards that bore her name, and had to leave when tears threatened. Nobody knew why their famously cold leader suddenly cared so much about maternal support services. Nobody knew he was trying to atone for failures they couldn't imagine, trying to help women he'd abandoned in spirit, if not body. His colleagues whispered about the change. His intensity had always been legendary, the fury, the passion, the absolute commitment to winning. But this new version unsettled them more. He won deals without celebrating, acquired companies without satisfaction, built empires that meant nothing to him. Success without joy was somehow more frightening than failure with passion. Women approached him at events, at conferences, in elevators. Beautiful, successful, interested women who saw his wealth and power and wanted proximity. He declined politely, felt nothing, went home alone. How could anyone compare to the woman who'd seen him at his worst and loved him anyway, who he'd thrown away with 4 careless words spoken in anger? How could anyone fill space that belonged to someone who'd shown him what life could be? His therapist suggested closure, moving on, acceptance. He stopped going after 3 sessions. Some wounds weren't meant to heal. Some losses were meant to hurt forever as punishment for causing them. The pain was deserved. Carrying it was the least he could do. He thought about her constantly, wondered if she was happy, if she'd found someone better, if she ever thought about him, hoped she didn't, hoped she'd moved on completely, found joy without him, proved she didn't need what he'd failed to give. Better one of them be happy than neither. Better she build a good life somewhere than waste any time mourning what they'd had. Sometimes he'd drive past her old apartment, park across the street, and stare at windows that held different lives now. The landlord had mentioned she'd left in a hurry, seemed upset, paid to break her lease early. That was all anyone knew. She'd disappeared as thoroughly as smoke, leaving no trace beyond the hole her absence created in his chest. His parents had taught him abandonment. The foster system reinforced the lesson. But losing Tara was different. This time he was the one who drove someone away, who proved love was temporary, who became exactly what he'd always feared becoming. He'd turned into his parents without even trying, had abandoned someone who needed him, had chosen work over love, had proven that damage begets damage and broken people break everything they touch. While Jay built monuments to his regret, Tara was building something more difficult, an actual life. The cafe job became management position, more responsibility and slightly better pay. Night classes led to freelance web design contracts that supplemented her income. The house slowly transformed from her grandmother's memory into her own space, painted in colors she chose, filled with sounds of children laughing and playing. Tiger grew into a force of nature, loud, fearless, constantly testing boundaries. He collected rocks and bugs, asked endless questions, never walked when running was possible. George was his opposite, quiet, thoughtful, cautious. He watched the world carefully before engaging, spoke in complete sentences, when most children his age used fragments, found comfort in routine and familiar things. They were different, but inseparable, fought like enemies and loved like soulmates, shared a language of twin bond that excluded everyone else, finishing each other's sentences and knowing each other's thoughts without speaking. Tara watched them grow and saw pieces of a man they'd never met, his grey eyes, his stubborn jaw, his sharp intelligence softened by her warmth. She never spoke his name around them, created a careful narrative where their father was someone busy and far away, not cruel or absent, just impossible. Let them believe in a kind fiction rather than a painful truth. They deserved better than knowing they weren't wanted, deserved better than carrying the weight of someone else's failure. Birdie became family. The cafe owner who'd hired a desperate pregnant woman without questions now babysat when needed, dispensed wisdom without being asked, loved the boys like they were her own grandchildren. She never pushed terror about the father, never suggested she should try again with someone new, just accepted the story as told and offered support without conditions. The town embraced them slowly. Small places are suspicious of outsiders, but Tara's genuine kindness and hard work won people over. She fixed neighbors' computers, designed websites for local establishments at steep discounts, showed up for community events even when exhausted. Gradually, she stopped being the mysterious woman from the city and became simply Tara. Someone they knew, someone who belonged, someone who'd earned her place through consistent presence. The boys started asking questions around their 3rd birthday. Why didn't they have a daddy like other kids? Where was he? Would he ever come? Tara crafted careful answers that were true without being cruel, maintained the fiction that sometimes people loved each other but couldn't be together, that it wasn't anyone's fault, that love was complicated but theirs for each other was simple and sure. They accepted this the way children accept all difficult truths, with resilient hearts and minimal questions. She built walls around her heart, brick by brick, learned to be content with small joys, the boys' laughter, morning coffee on the porch. Work that satisfied, if not thrilled. A life that was safe, even if it wasn't everything she'd once imagined. Safety mattered more than passion. Predictability mattered more than possibility. Control mattered more than risk. She was surviving. He was existing. Neither was truly living. Both had accepted their separate fates, convinced the distance between them was permanent, that what was broken couldn't be repaired, that some stories end badly and stay ended. Both had learned to carry their wounds quietly, to function despite the pain, to pretend they were fine when they were anything but. They were wrong. Fate wasn't finished with them yet. The universe had plans they couldn't see, connections they couldn't imagine, moments waiting that would force them both to confront what they'd spent years avoiding. Sometimes the past refuses to stay buried. Sometimes distance closes, despite best efforts. Sometimes what's lost finds its way back when you least expect it. Chapter 4. Rain and Reckoning. The car died with a sputter and grinding sound that promised expensive repairs. Jay coasted to the shoulder of a rural highway, rain hammering against the windshield, and realized his phone had no signal. The meeting he was supposed to attend, some deal that would add another meaningless company to his collection, was still hours away in a town barely on the map. He sat in silence, watching rain turn the world grey. This trip was pointless anyway. Everything was pointless. He'd been going through motions for so long, he'd forgotten what genuine purpose felt like. Years had passed since Tara left, and he'd filled them with motion that never moved him closer to anything real. An old gas station materialized through the rain, its lights blinking weakly against the storm. He locked the car and jogged toward shelter. Expensive suit immediately soaked, leather shoes ruined by mud. None of it mattered. Things never mattered, only people mattered, and he'd lost the only person who'd ever broken through his walls. The attendant made calls for a tow truck that wouldn't arrive for at least an hour. Jay stood under the awning watching rain pour off the edges, creating a curtain between him and everything else. Fitting metaphor for his life, separated from the world by barriers of his own making, isolated by choices that seemed smart until they left him completely alone. Movement caught his eye through the downpour. A figure with a broken umbrella, walking with purpose despite the storm. Two small shapes huddled against her, splashing through puddles with the fearless joy only children possess. Something about the woman's walk made his heart stutter. A familiar rhythm, a gesture he'd memorized without meaning to. The way she moved through space, like she belonged there. The umbrella flipped inside out. She fought with it briefly, then gave up, laughing at something one of the children said. The sound carried across the rain-soaked parking lot, and Jay's entire world stopped. That laugh, he knew that laugh, had heard it in dreams, had mourned its absence in every silent corner of his empty life. Terror. His legs moved without permission, carrying him into the rain towards something that couldn't be real but was. She turned as he approached, still laughing, and her face came into focus. Older, more tired, but unmistakably her. Those eyes that had once looked at him with love now showed only surprise, then recognition, then something that looked like stone, settling over features that used to be soft. The boys, twins, impossibly identical, stared up at him with eyes he recognized from mirrors. His eyes, his face softened by her features, made beautiful instead of harsh. They had his widow's peak, his jaw, his nose. Everything about them screamed the truth he'd somehow never imagined. She'd been pregnant, had his children, raised them alone, while he built meaningless monuments to guilt. The realization hit him like a physical blow, knocked the air from his lungs, made the world tilt sideways. Terror. Her name came out broken, barely audible against the rain. The boys moved behind her legs, suddenly shy, sensing tension they couldn't understand. She put a hand on each small head, protective, keeping them close. Her face showed nothing, no anger, no hurt, just flat emptiness that was somehow worse than fury. "You told me to handle it myself." Her voice was quiet, steady, final. I did. The words hit harder than any scream. He'd said that, thrown those exact words at her like weapons, dismissed her existence, destroyed everything with 4 careless syllables spoken in anger. And she'd handled it, alone, for years, while he'd convinced himself she'd left because she wanted to, because he wasn't enough, because love was temporary. She'd handled it because he'd given her no choice. She pointed to the boys without emotion, like reciting facts. Tiger, George, say hello to the stranger. Tiger peeked out, waved shyly with small fingers. George stayed hidden, gripping her pants leg with both fists. Stranger. She'd called him a stranger. He was their father, and they didn't know him, would never know him, had lived entire lives without his existence mattering at all. He tried to speak, tried to find words for the enormity of this moment, for the recognition of what he'd lost, for the children he'd never known existed. But his throat closed around sounds that wouldn't form into meaning. What could he possibly say? What words could bridge the distance of years of abandonment, of 2 children growing up without their father because he'd been too angry and selfish to see what mattered? Tara looked at him with those stone eyes, waiting for something. An explanation? An apology? Some magic words that could undo years of absence? But there were no magic words, no explanation sufficient, no apology that would erase what he'd done or failed to do. She took both small hands in hers, the gesture so protective it broke something inside him. We need to go. The rain's getting worse. Wait, he managed, but she was already walking away. The umbrella hung useless from her wrist. Rain soaked through their clothes. The boys looked back once, identical, curious faces, his features miniaturized and made innocent, then faced forward, trusting their mother to lead them somewhere safe. He stood frozen as they disappeared around a corner, unable to process that they were real, that they existed, that he'd found them and immediately lost them again in the span of minutes. His legs gave out. He collapsed against a brick wall, slid down until he was sitting in a puddle, rain pouring over him, and finally let himself break. The years of holding everything together, of surviving through work and distraction, of pretending he was fine, all of it shattered. He wept like something dying, great gasping sobs that hurt his chest, tears mixing with rain until he couldn't tell which was which. He'd found his family, his sons, the woman he'd never stopped loving, and they looked at him like he was nothing, because that's exactly what he'd proven himself to be. The tow truck driver found him there eventually, soaked and shaking, looking like a man who'd seen something that broke him. Asked if he needed a hospital. Jay shook his head, gave the name of the town's only inn, and spent the drive staring at nothing while his mind repeated the same words on loop. Handle it yourself. I did. Those 4 words he'd thrown at her had created 4 words of response that destroyed him completely. She'd handled it, alone, had his children, raised them, built a life without him, and done it all because he'd been too angry, too busy, too broken to see what mattered until it was gone. The inn-room was cheap and clean and utterly empty. He sat on the bed and pulled out his phone. No missed calls, no urgent messages. The deal he'd been driving toward didn't matter. Nothing in his empire mattered. Everything he'd thought was important was revealed as meaningless distraction from the only thing that had ever actually counted. He'd found his family, and they didn't want him. He'd earned that, deserved that, had no right to feel hurt when he was the one who'd caused all of it. But knowing he deserved it didn't stop the agony, didn't make the image of those boys' faces any easier to bear, didn't erase the flatness in her eyes when she looked at him like he was nothing. He'd spent years thinking he'd lost her. He'd been wrong. He'd never had her to lose. He'd thrown her away. And now he'd finally, devastatingly understood exactly what that meant. The weight of his choices settled on his chest like concrete. He'd destroyed the only good thing in his life and created 2 children who would grow up never knowing their father because he'd been too damaged to recognize love when it was offered. But something else settled alongside the guilt. A determination, a resolve. He'd found them. After years of believing they were lost forever, he'd found them. And maybe he didn't deserve forgiveness. Maybe he'd never earn back what he'd destroyed. But he could try, could show up, could prove through actions what his words had failed to convey. He didn't know if it would work, didn't know if time could heal what he'd broken. But sitting in that cheap inn-room, soaked and shattered, Jay Underhill made a decision. He wasn't leaving, wasn't returning to his old life, wasn't going to let this second chance slip away. He'd stay, would show up, would prove that people could change if they wanted it badly enough. The empire could collapse. The wealth could disappear. None of it mattered compared to those grey eyes looking up at him from small faces. Compared to a woman who'd survived his worst and built something beautiful from the ruins. Compared to the possibility, however small, that maybe broken things could be repaired if someone was willing to do the work. He called his assistant and cancelled everything. Every meeting, every obligation, every piece of his old life that demanded his attention. Let them think what they wanted. He'd finally figured out what actually mattered, and this time, he wasn't walking away. Chapter 5. The Art of Showing Up. Morning came too bright for the weight pressing against his chest. Jay hadn't slept, just stared at water-stained ceiling tiles while his mind replayed two small faces, grey eyes that matched his own, a woman whose love he'd destroyed with his carelessness. The suite felt suffocating despite its size, expensive but hollow. Exactly like everything else he'd built over years of mistaking success for happiness. He called his assistant before dawn broke completely. Cancelled the deal, cleared his schedule indefinitely, offered no explanation for the sudden change. Let them think what they wanted. None of it mattered anymore compared to what he'd found, what he'd lost, what he might possibly reclaim if he was willing to do the work. Finding where she worked took less than an hour. Small towns had rhythms easy to decode. He asked the innkeeper about good coffee, got directions to the copper kettle, and felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he walked the block separating him from seeing her again. Each step felt like approaching something sacred, something he'd already profaned once and couldn't afford to damage further. The cafe sat on a corner with yellow paint peeling from its siding. Mismatched chairs visible through the windows, hand-painted signs advertising daily specials. It looked nothing like the upscale restaurants they used to frequent. It looked real, lived in, the kind of place that survived on community rather than prestige, on relationships rather than reputation. He pushed through the door and found her immediately. She was behind the counter, taking orders, hair pulled back, wearing a simple uniform, looking tired but genuine in a way the penthouse version of her never had. This was who she'd always been, beneath the fancy clothes and expensive dinners. Someone who worked hard, who smiled at strangers, who belonged in small, honest places where people knew your name and your story. She glanced up as the door chimed, saw him, and her expression went carefully blank. Not angry, not hurt, just nothing. A wall so complete it might as well have been made of steel. She finished taking the customer's order, handed them change, and only then acknowledged his existence with the smallest nod. Permission to stay, but not to presume anything more. He sat in the corner booth, the one farthest from the counter, trying to take up as little space as possible. Ordered coffee. He had no intention of drinking when she approached with her notepad. Her eyes never quite met his, staying focused on the pad, on her hands, on anything except his face. She wrote down his order, walked away, delivered the cup without a word. Professional, distant, like he was any other customer instead of the father of her children. The coffee grew cold, while he pretended to read a newspaper someone had left behind. Words blurred together, meaningless. All he could see was her moving through the cafe, serving other customers, laughing at someone's joke, being effortlessly kind to everyone except him. Not cruel, just absent, like he didn't register as worth the effort of emotion. An older woman, working alongside Tara, kept glancing his way, eyebrows raised in obvious curiosity. She eventually leaned close to Tara and whispered something. Tara shook her head sharply, said something too quiet to hear, and the woman backed off, but continued watching him like he was something dangerous that needed monitoring. He came back the next day. And the next, always the same booth, always the same order, always the same careful distance. Terror served him with mechanical politeness, took his money, never lingered. Days blurred together, marked only by the brief moments when she'd approach his table, and he'd try to find something to say that wouldn't sound hollow or presumptuous. The third day, the twins arrived after what must have been preschool. They burst through the door, with backpacks too big for their small frames, chattering about something that happened on the playground. Tara's whole face transformed when she saw them, lit from within, smiled with her whole body, dropped everything to hug them close with fierce love that made his chest ache. Tiger noticed him first. The boy stared openly with those familiar grey eyes, then waved with the unself-conscious friendliness of young children who haven't learned to be suspicious yet. The gesture was casual, meant nothing to the child, but it hit Jay like lightning. His son, his actual child, had acknowledged him, had waved like maybe he wasn't a complete stranger. George peeked from behind his brother, clutching something in his small fist. Considering the situation with that thoughtful expression Tara had described in the letter Jay had never read. Then the boy approached slowly, stopping several feet away, studying Jay with careful attention. George thrust out his hand, revealing a crayon drawing on computer paper. A dinosaur, green and purple, with too many teeth and spikes everywhere. The artistry of someone who drew with more enthusiasm than skill. "Do you like dinosaurs?" The question was serious, delivered with the weight of someone asking about fundamental truths. "I do," Jay managed, voice rougher than intended. "This is beautiful. Did you draw it?" George nodded solemnly. "His name is Spike. He eats plants, not people." "That's good. I like dinosaurs who don't eat people." George studied him for a long moment with eyes that saw more than children should, then carefully set the drawing on the table and retreated to his brother. They whispered together, looking back occasionally, clearly discussing the stranger in the corner booth who their mother kept serving but never talked to. Tara appeared and herded them toward the back. Her eyes met his for just a second, and in that moment he saw something other than stone. Maybe warning, maybe pain, maybe just exhaustion from maintaining walls that took effort to hold up. Then she was gone, taking the boys with her, leaving him alone with a child's drawing he held like it was made of something more precious than paper. He noticed things as days accumulated. The cafe's awning was torn, letting rain pour through onto the outdoor tables that nobody used anymore. The playground equipment at what must be their preschool had rusted swings that looked dangerous, chains worn thin. Tara's car made a grinding sound every time she started it, the kind of noise that promised expensive repairs she probably couldn't afford on cafe wages. He began fixing things quietly. Showed up at dawn before the cafe opened and repaired the awning with materials bought from the local hardware store. Replaced the playground swings anonymously, leaving no note, no explanation, no signature that would reveal who'd done it. Tucked money in an envelope with a mechanic's card under her windshield wiper, hoping she'd use it without knowing it came from him. She returned the money the next day, left it on his table next to his untouched coffee, said nothing, walked away. The message was clear. She wanted nothing from him. No help, no charity. No attempts to buy his way into their lives with gestures that cost him nothing but meant everything to someone living paycheck to paycheck. He changed tactics, joined the town's weekend cleanup crew, showed up at the community center's food drive, helped repair the library's crumbling front steps, made himself useful without seeking credit, without expecting gratitude, without demanding anything in return, just being present, just showing up, just proving through consistent action that he wasn't leaving, wasn't giving up, wasn't going to disappear again. The town noticed eventually. Word spread in the way small places spread information, quietly, thoroughly, with judgment reserved but noted. The fancy man with expensive watch and city clothes was always around now, never causing trouble, just working, helping, being there without making demands or drawing attention. Tara's neighbor mentioned it in the cafe one morning, loud enough to carry. "That fellow's been here weeks now, Birdie. Ain't left yet. Fixed Mrs. Blake's porch rail yesterday, didn't even ask for thanks." Birdie, the older woman who worked beside Tara, raised her eyebrows. "Some men learn eventually. Most don't. We'll see which kind he is." Jay pretended not to hear, but the words settled somewhere deep. He had to be the kind who learned. Had to prove through action what words could never convey, that he'd changed, that he understood what mattered, that he'd spend however long it took showing up. The boys grew comfortable with his presence gradually. Tiger started bringing more drawings, sitting at his table to color, while narrating elaborate stories about superheroes and space adventures. George remained quieter, but would occasionally share information about rocks he'd collected, explain their different types with serious concentration that reminded Jay of Tara's focus when she was designing. Jay memorized everything, learned that Tiger loved trains but was scared of the dark, that George liked green beans but not carrots, that they both thought the moon followed them home at night. He learned their voices, their laughs, their small preferences and big dreams, learned how to be near them without pushing, how to exist in their world without demanding space they weren't ready to give. Tara watched all of this with careful eyes. He never approached her directly, never asked for conversation, never presumed he'd earned the right to her attention. Just showed up every day, fixed things that were broken, was present without being intrusive, let his actions speak, since his words had already proven worthless. One evening, as the cafe was closing, a drunk driver jumped the curb 2 blocks away, crashed into the pharmacy, sent glass exploding across the sidewalk. Jay ran toward the sound with others, helped pull the elderly pharmacist from the wreckage, stayed until paramedics arrived and police had statements from everyone who'd witnessed it. Tara watched from the cafe doorway, boys pressed against her sides. When he returned, covered in dust and small cuts from broken glass, she had coffee waiting. Fresh, hot, the first thing she'd offered voluntarily since he'd arrived in town. She set it down without comment, without meeting his eyes, but the gesture said more than words. He was still a stranger, but maybe not quite as much as before. Progress measured in millimeters, but progress nonetheless. And Jay had learned patience, had learned that love wasn't something you declared or demanded. It was something you proved through endless small actions, through being present even when unwelcome, through waiting without expectation of reward. He'd wait as long as it took. Would show up every day, would prove that people could change if they wanted it badly enough, if they were willing to do the work, if they finally understood what actually mattered. The empire could collapse. The wealth could disappear. None of it meant anything compared to coffee served without hostility, to a child's drawing given freely, to the possibility that maybe, eventually, walls could come down if someone was patient enough to wait for them to fall. Chapter 6. When the Smoke Clears. Months of showing up had taught Jay more about patience than years of building companies ever could. He'd learned that love wasn't something you declared or demanded. It was something you proved through endless small actions, through being present even when unwelcome, through waiting without expectation of reward. Each day brought tiny increments of progress, moments so small they were almost invisible, but collectively meant everything. Tara remained guarded, but the stone in her eyes had developed hairline fractures. She'd begun acknowledging him with small nods instead of complete silence, occasionally asked how he was settling into town, once mentioned that the library steps he'd helped repair looked good. Progress so gradual it was almost invisible, but he clung to each moment like evidence of possibility. The boys had fully adopted him into their daily routine. Tiger ran to his booth the moment he arrived at the cafe, chattering about preschool adventures, while Jay listened with complete attention, asking questions that showed genuine interest. George still approached more carefully, but had started leaving his entire rock collection on the table for examination, explaining each specimen's properties with endearing seriousness that made Jay's heart ache with how much he'd missed. Birdie had warmed to him slightly, which felt like victory given her initial suspicion. She'd caught him one morning helping unload delivery trucks and remarked that most rich folk didn't know which end of a box to lift. He'd taken it as the compliment it was, proof that maybe he was being seen as something other than the stranger with money. The town's rhythm had absorbed him completely. He knew the names of regular customers now, helped Mrs. Blake with her groceries when he saw her struggling, played chess with old men in the park who appreciated someone young, willing to lose gracefully, attended church services, because that's what people did here, and belonging mattered more than belief. He was becoming part of something real, instead of ruling over something hollow. Tara noticed these changes. He'd catch her watching him sometimes, with an expression he couldn't quite read. Maybe confusion, maybe curiosity, maybe the faint stirring of something she was afraid to name. She told Birdie once, not knowing he was in earshot, that she didn't know if he'd changed or was just guilty, that guilt faded, but character didn't. Her words haunted him through sleepless nights. Was he different or just performing difference? The question kept him awake, staring at ceiling cracks in his rental cottage, wondering if transformation was real or just elaborate pretense. He thought about the man he'd been, cold, controlled, convinced that vulnerability was weakness. That man had lost everything that mattered. This version of himself felt raw and uncertain, but somehow more genuine, more aligned with who he actually was, beneath the armor he'd built over painful years. The boys asked about him now. He'd overheard Tiger wondering why he was always at the cafe, if he was lonely, if maybe they should invite him for dinner. George had responded that Mama looked sad when she thought nobody was watching, and maybe the sad man could make her less sad since they were both sad together. Their logic was so pure it hurt. They saw what adults couldn't admit, that he and Tara were both broken, both hurting, both unable to bridge the distance that history had created. Children understood that loneliness recognized loneliness, that maybe broken things fit together better than whole things ever could. Then came the night everything changed again, the night that would test whether his transformation was real or just temporary performance that would fade under pressure. Tara lived in the apartment above the cafe, a cramped space she'd mentioned once when explaining why the boys did homework at the corner table instead of going home. The building was old, wiring older, repairs she couldn't afford deferred indefinitely. Jay had noticed these things, had wanted to help, but knew she'd refuse any offer that came with his name attached, so he'd done nothing and felt guilty about his inaction. The fire started just before midnight, faulty wiring in the cafe's kitchen, a spark that found old grease and hungry wood, flames that spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. Terror woke to smoke filling the apartment, alarm shrieking, heat pressing through the floor beneath her bed. The boys were asleep in their shared room down the hall. She stumbled through smoke trying to reach them, but the hallway was already impassable, flames climbing the walls, heat driving her back toward the window. She screamed their names, tried again, was forced back by smoke that seared her lungs and made breathing impossible. Jay was driving another sleepless circuit past the cafe, like his presence could somehow protect them, even from a distance. He saw smoke pouring from second-floor windows and didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't calculate risk or consider consequences. Just slammed the brakes and ran toward the building while pulling out his phone to call emergency services. The cafe's front door was locked. He kicked it until the frame splintered, charged into smoke and heat that immediately blinded him. Dropped low where air was clearer, followed the sound of terror screaming upstairs, found the back stairs, and climbed through fire that grabbed at his clothes and skin, like living things trying to pull him down. The boys' room was at the end of the hall. He crawled the distance on hands and knees, found them huddled in their closet like Terror had taught them for emergencies, both crying but alive and unhurt. He grabbed one under each arm, so small, so light, so impossibly precious, and carried them through flames that seemed determined to keep them, handed them to strangers outside who'd gathered at the sound of sirens, heard paramedics shouting instructions, turned back because terror was still inside, and that was the only thought that mattered. Ignored people yelling for him to stop, charged back into the building as fire consumed the stairs he'd just descended. Found her collapsed near where the hallway used to be, unconscious from smoke, flames closing in from all sides like walls made of death. He lifted her like she weighed nothing, staggered toward what remained of the exit, felt part of the ceiling collapse behind them, and burst through the doorway as the structure groaned and surrendered to the fire, collapsed on the sidewalk with terror unconscious across his lap, his hands burned and bleeding, lungs full of smoke that made breathing feel like swallowing glass, but alive. The boys were screaming for their mother somewhere nearby. Paramedics were everywhere suddenly. Someone was trying to pull her from his arms, but he couldn't let go, couldn't release her, couldn't believe she was safe until he felt her breathing against his chest. The hospital was clean and bright, and full of people asking questions he couldn't answer through damaged lungs. His hands were wrapped in bandages after someone cleaned the burns that covered his palms and fingers. They gave him oxygen and medication and told him he was lucky, though luck felt like the wrong word for surviving something that should have killed him. Tara and the boys were treated for smoke inhalation. The doctor said they'd be fine, needed observation but nothing serious, would recover completely with rest and time. Jay sagged with relief so intense it felt like breaking, like every muscle in his body giving up now that the emergency was over and they were safe. The boys were released after hours of observation. They'd stay with Birdie until Tara could care for them, until the cafe was rebuilt and the apartment restored. But Tara insisted on remaining at the hospital, refused to leave despite nurses telling her to rest, sat beside his bed through the night, despite everything between them. At 3 a.m, he woke to find her there. She was staring at his bandaged hands, face streaked with soot and tears, looking destroyed and beautiful and real in a way that made his chest ache. She reached out slowly, like approaching something wild that might flee, and touched his bandaged hand with fingertips that trembled. The gesture was tentative, careful, but it was touch. Actual voluntary contact? The first time in years, her fingers rested against the bandages covering burns he'd earned, saving her life, saving their sons, proving through action what words could never convey. "You saved them," she whispered, voice rough from smoke. He couldn't speak past the tightness in his throat and the damage smoke had done. Just nodded, watching her face, memorizing this moment when walls finally started to crack. "You saved us." "I'd burn 1,000 times, he managed, voice wrecked from smoke and emotion. "For all of you. Every time." Without hesitation. She didn't respond immediately. Just sat there touching his hand, crying silently. Walls crumbling so visibly he could see each brick of protection falling away. Years of hurt, of survival, of protecting herself from more pain, all of it dissolving under the weight of what he'd done, what he'd proven, what he'd been willing to sacrifice. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable, just full of words unspoken, of years compressed into single moments, of the terrible awareness that life was fragile and second chances were rare. She'd almost lost her children. He'd almost lost all of them. Sometimes it took fire to burn away everything false and leave only truth. She stayed through the night, stayed through the next day, stayed until he was released, refusing to leave his side, like maybe if she looked away he'd disappear and she'd discover it was all a dream. When the doctors finally cleared him to go, she walked beside him without touching but staying close. Her presence saying everything her words couldn't. Outside in morning sunlight that felt too bright after the darkness of the hospital, she finally spoke again. "I need to know something." He waited, prepared for any question, any demand, any test she needed him to pass. "Why did you come back?" The second time, into the fire, when everyone was telling you to stop and the building was collapsing. The answer was simple. Obvious, the only truth that mattered more than breathing, because you were still inside. Chapter 7. The Name Beneath the Name. Jay spent days in the hospital recovering, while his mind replayed fire and smoke and the weight of small bodies in his arms. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flames and heard terror screaming. Every time he woke, he felt the ghost of burns that doctors promised would heal without permanent damage beyond scars. Physical wounds faded with time and treatment. The kinds never did, just settled into permanent ache you learned to carry. Terror visited both days, bringing the boys for brief supervised periods that lifted his spirit more than any medication could. Tiger talked endlessly about the fire trucks and firefighters, already turning trauma into adventure the way children mercifully do, processing fear through excitement and storytelling. George stayed quieter, drew pictures of the event with crayons on hospital paper, processing differently, but processing nonetheless, creating narratives he could control. They were okay. That mattered more than anything else in the world. More than his burned hands or damaged lungs. More than the cafe that was gone, or the apartment that had burned. Things could be replaced. Buildings could be rebuilt. But those two small lives, those grey eyes looking at him with trust he hadn't earned yet, those were irreplaceable. Those were everything. Terror brought him changes of clothes from somewhere, sat in the chair beside his bed, reading to the boys while he pretended to sleep and just listened. Her voice soothed something deep inside, reminded him of the months they'd lived together when he'd been foolish enough to think happiness could last without effort, without work, without choosing it deliberately every single day. On the second evening, a doctor entered to check his vitals and update insurance information. Young physician with tired eyes who'd probably been on shift too long. Clipboard in hand, calling him by a name that wasn't his. Mr. Holloway, we need you to sign these forms for your continued care. Tara looked up from her book, confusion crossing her face like clouds shadowing sun. His name is Underhill. The doctor paused, checked his paperwork with a frown, clearly trying to reconcile conflicting information in his records. Insurance records show Holloway. Legal name change was... He scanned the documents with increasing confusion. Years ago. Pretty common, actually. People want fresh starts after divorces, family issues, that sort of thing. Administrative mix-up, probably, but the legal documents are clear. The doctor left after getting signatures, completely unaware of the bomb he'd detonated in the middle of the quiet hospital room. Tara sat frozen, staring at Jay with questions he could see forming behind her eyes like storms gathering on horizons. The boys were distracted with coloring books, oblivious to the tension suddenly filling the room, like pressure before lightning. You changed your name. Not a question. A statement delivered flatly, like she was trying to process information that didn't fit with anything she thought she knew about him. He could lie, could deflect, could avoid the conversation that would open wounds he'd spent years trying to forget existed, trying to bury under success and distance. But he'd promised himself no more hiding, no more protecting her from truths she deserved to know, no more walls between them when walls had already destroyed everything once. Yes, the word came out heavy, weighted with everything it represented. Why? She deserved the full story, not the abbreviated version. Deserved to understand what had made him who he was, what had broken him so thoroughly that love felt impossible. The word hung between them like smoke still lingering. Why does someone erase their identity? Why does someone decide the name they were born with is too poisonous to carry? Why does someone start over so completely they legally become someone new, burning bridges to their past so thoroughly there's no path back? Because the name Holloway was connected to people I never wanted to be associated with again. Because carrying that name meant carrying their crimes, their shame, their legacy of destruction everywhere I went. She waited, patient but insistent, giving him space to tell the story at his own pace, but making clear she wouldn't accept evasion. The boys were coloring quietly, giving them space without knowing why, sensing adult conversation that didn't include them. He'd never told her about his parents during their relationship, had deflected questions about family, changed subjects when she pushed, maintained the fiction that his childhood was simply unfortunate rather than actively destructive. She knew about foster care, but not what came before. Knew he was self-made, but not what he'd had to burn down to rebuild himself. "My parents," he started, then had to stop and gather breath because even after all these years speaking, their names felt like swallowing glass. Were Richard and Donna Holloway. They ran an investment scheme that defrauded hundreds of people out of their life savings. When I was a teenager, it collapsed. Instead of facing consequences, instead of trying to make things right, they abandoned me to Child Protective Services and fled the country. Tara's hand covered her mouth. The boys looked up at her, sharp inhale, concerned, then returned to coloring, when she smiled reassuringly even though tears were gathering in her eyes. They left me with nothing except their last name and the reputation they'd destroyed. Every foster family knew who I was. Son of criminals, probably damaged, definitely trouble. Teachers looked at me differently. Other kids' parents wouldn't let them be friends with me. I carried their shame like it was tattooed on my forehead. Like I was guilty by association, even though I'd been their victim too. His voice was flat, reciting facts without emotion because feeling it was still too much, even after all this time. Some wounds never fully healed, just scabbed over thin enough that picking at them made them bleed again. I testified against them when I was a teenager because the prosecutor said it might help the victims recover some of their money. My own parents, and I helped send them to prison because it was the right thing to do. But doing the right thing didn't make it hurt less, didn't make me feel less like a traitor, even though they'd betrayed me first. Tara looked like she was seeing him for the first time, understanding pieces that had never made sense before. His coldness around the word family, his insistence that attachments led to betrayal, his conviction that he'd ruin anything he tried to love because destruction was all he knew how to create. When I turned into an adult, he continued, voice breaking slightly, I legally changed my name. Spent money I didn't have on lawyers to erase any connection to them. Became Jay Underhill because that person had no history, no shame attached, could build something without their poison touching it. Could exist in the world without everyone looking at me and seeing their crimes reflected back. He'd wanted to be someone new, someone who wasn't defined by other people's failures, someone who could succeed without everyone assuming he'd inherited his parents' criminal tendencies. The name change was rebirth, was burning down the past so completely that nothing remained except ashes he could build on. I thought changing my name would change who I was, he said quietly. Thought becoming someone new meant I could escape what they'd made me. But you can't escape damage by calling it something different. You can't heal wounds by pretending they don't exist. I just carried all the same fears and brokenness under a different name. When you told me you were pregnant, his voice broke completely now, tears streaming down his face without shame. All I could think was that I'd become them. That I'd damaged those children the way they damaged me. That love was just another con waiting to collapse. That family was just people waiting to abandon each other when things got hard. So I pushed you away before I could hurt you worse than I already had. Tara's own tears were flowing freely now, understanding dawning across her face like sunrise after the longest night. You were scared, terrified, he admitted, the word barely audible. I was so scared of becoming them that I became them anyway. Did exactly what they did. Abandoned someone who needed me. Chose myself over responsibility. Proved that damage begets damage and broken people break everything they touch. She stood slowly, careful not to wake the boys who'd fallen asleep on the floor, surrounded by their drawings. Approached his bed, sat on the edge carefully, finally looked at him with something other than walls. Looked at him with understanding, with compassion, with the recognition that sometimes people's worst actions come from their deepest wounds. I'm not saying it makes it okay. she said quietly, voice firm but gentle. What you said still hurt, still left me alone and scared for years, still forced me to build a life without you while carrying your children and wondering if I'd done something wrong, if I'd been inadequate, if I'd failed somehow. I know, he whispered, because what else could he say? There was no excuse good enough, no explanation that erased years of pain. But I understand now why you said it. The understanding felt like a gift he didn't deserve, like mercy extended to someone who'd earned judgment instead. She reached out again, touched his bandaged hand like she had the first night after the fire, this time with less hesitation and more intention. Jay Underhill? She tested the name like tasting something unfamiliar, rolling it around to see how it felt. Is very different from the man I met years ago. I hope so. I've been trying to be. The man I met would have let me walk into that fire, would have calculated the risk and chosen safety for himself. He started to protest, but she continued, voice firm with conviction. The man who ran into burning building twice without hesitation didn't calculate anything. Didn't think about himself or his safety or the risk. Just acted on instinct to save the people he loved. They're my children. He stopped, unable to finish the sentence in a way that captured the enormity of what she was to him, what she'd always been, even when he'd been too broken to admit it. I'm what? She asked it gently, giving him space to name what had always been true. Everything. The word came out broken, cracked down the middle with years of suppressed emotion. You're everything I threw away because I was too damaged to recognize what I had, too scared to believe it could last, too convinced that love was temporary to realize some things are worth fighting for, even when you're terrified. Tara's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she didn't look away this time, just sat there touching his ruined hands that would bear scars forever, letting the truth settle between them like foundation stones, allowing the possibility that maybe understanding could lead to something more than just comprehension. I can't forgive you yet, she said finally, voice steady, despite tears. I'm not ready! The hurt is still too fresh, too deep. Maybe I won't ever be completely free of it. I understand, and he did. Forgiveness wasn't something owed or demanded. It was something earned slowly through consistent action, through proving day after day that change was real. But I want to try. The words came out hesitant, scared, brave all at once. I want to believe people can change. That damage doesn't have to be permanent. That sometimes broken things can be repaired if both people are willing to do the work. To be patient, to accept that healing isn't linear or simple. Hope fluttered in his chest, fragile and terrifying like a bird with broken wings trying to fly. What does that mean? What are you saying? It means we start over, slowly, carefully, as two people who share children and a complicated past and maybe, possibly a future, if we're both willing to fight for it. If you're willing to keep showing up even when it's hard. If I'm willing to risk being hurt again for the possibility of something better. She stood, collected the sleeping boys carefully, prepared to leave. But at the door she paused, looked back at him, lying in the hospital bed with his bandaged hands and hopeful eyes. The name fits you better than the old one ever could, she said softly. Jay Underhill sounds like someone who learned how to build things that matter instead of things that just look impressive. Sounds like someone who finally figured out what's worth burning for. Then she was gone, taking the boys with her, leaving him alone in the hospital. A room with wounds that hurt less than they should, and hope that hurt more than he expected because hope was dangerous. When you'd lived without it for so long, he'd shown her his ugliest truth, the shame he'd carried, the damage he'd inherited, the fear that had driven every terrible choice. And she hadn't run, hadn't rejected him completely, had simply said, let's try, which was more than he deserved and everything he needed. Sometimes second chances arrived wearing bandages and smelling like smoke. Sometimes they arrived exactly when you'd stopped expecting them but needed them most. Sometimes understanding someone's past didn't excuse their actions, but it explained them, and explanation created space for possibility that hadn't existed before. Jay lay in that hospital bed long after visiting hours ended, staring at his bandaged hands, and finally allowed himself to hope. Not for immediate forgiveness or instant reconciliation, but for the chance to prove through consistent action that people could change, that damage didn't have to be permanent, that sometimes love was worth fighting for, even when the fight was hard and long and uncertain. He'd spent years running from his past. Now he was ready to face it, to own it, to transform it into something that could help rather than hurt. The name Underhill represented that transformation, not escape from who he'd been, but evolution into who he could become. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to build on. Chapter 8. Small Hands, Big Hearts. The cafe was gone, reduced to charred skeleton and melted dreams. Insurance would eventually cover rebuilding. But for now, Tara and the boys were staying with Birdie in her small house on the edge of town. Jay found a rental cottage near the park, furnished it with thrift store basics and remnants of lives other people had discarded, and continued his strange new existence of living in the same space as his family, while not quite being part of it yet. Tara had said they could start over slowly, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. No grand gestures, no rushing forward pretending years of hurt could be erased overnight. Just careful steps towards something neither could quite name but both desperately wanted. She invited him for dinner once a week. Nothing fancy, just simple meals where they'd talk carefully around the hard topics while the boys filled silence with chatter. Let him take the boys to the park on Saturday mornings, supervised at first, then gradually with more trust as she watched him be consistently present, allowed proximity without demanding commitment, giving them both room to figure out what this new version of their relationship could become. Room to breathe, to heal, to discover who they were to each other now after everything that had broken and been rebuilt. The boys made everything easier. They hadn't been told he was their father yet. Tara wanted to wait until she was certain he'd stay, until his presence was solid enough to name without fear that naming it would make it disappear. But they'd adopted him into their world, with the easy acceptance of children who don't overthink attachment, who love freely until given reason not to. Tiger appointed himself tour guide of their temporary home at Birdie's, showing Jay every corner with elaborate explanations about which rooms were best for hiding during hide-and-seek and which floorboards creaked loudest. George gave him rocks from his carefully curated collection, each one presented with serious information about its composition and origin and why it was special enough to keep. They included him naturally, unconsciously, like he'd always been there, like his presence was as normal as breathing. Watching them broke and healed him simultaneously. Every gesture reminded him of what he'd missed. First steps he hadn't witnessed, first words he hadn't heard, years of small moments that could never be recovered no matter how much he wished otherwise. But every new moment they shared felt like grace, like undeserved opportunity to be present for everything that came next. He learned to cook actual food through trial and error that resulted in more error than success. His first attempt at spaghetti resulted in something that resembled paste more than pasta. The boys ate it anyway, declared it delicious with the generosity of children who love you unconditionally. Tara laughed at his culinary disaster, and the sound filled something inside him that had been empty for years. They established routines slowly, testing what worked and what felt forced. Saturday mornings at the park, pushing swings and helping build elaborate sandcastles that Tiger destroyed immediately, while George carefully preserved and catalogued. Wednesday dinners, where Jay brought groceries and they cooked together, or tried to, usually ending with burn something and backup pizza ordered, while they laughed at their collective incompetence. Sunday afternoons, reading in Birdie's living room, boys sprawled between adults like bridges, everyone pretending they weren't slowly becoming something that looked suspiciously like family. Nobody named it. Naming things gave them power, made them real, opened them up to being lost again. Better to exist in the comfortable space of undefined connection. Terror watched him constantly, evaluating, measuring, looking for evidence that this change was real rather than temporary guilt that would fade once novelty wore off. He understood her caution, had earned her suspicion through his past failures, could only keep showing up consistently and hope eventually his actions would outweigh his history. One Wednesday evening, Tiger asked him to help with homework, basic preschool stuff, identifying shapes and colors and numbers that didn't make sense yet. They sat at Birdie's kitchen table while Tara cooked and George worked on his own assignment nearby. Simple domestic scene that should have been ordinary but felt miraculous to someone who'd thought he'd lost any chance at this kind of normal. "You're smart," Tiger announced after Jay helped him identify a particularly tricky hexagon. "Are you staying here forever?" The question stopped everything like record scratching. Tara froze mid-stir. George looked up from his coloring. Birdie paused her dishwashing. Everyone waiting to hear how he'd answer the impossible question that had no safe answer. "I'd like to," Jay said carefully, choosing words like stepping on stones across a river, "if that would be okay with everyone. If your mama thinks that's a good idea, it's okay with me," Tiger declared immediately, enthusiastically, like the matter was settled. "George, is it okay with you?" George considered seriously with that thoughtful expression he wore when processing big concepts, like he always did before making declarations. "Will you teach me more about rocks? About where they come from and how old they are?" "Every day, if you want. As many rocks as you can find." "Then yes. Forever is good." Tara turned back to cooking, but he saw her shoulders relax slightly. Saw something shift in her posture that suggested maybe she was starting to believe him, starting to trust that his presence wasn't temporary performance, but genuine transformation. That night after dinner, after the boys were asleep and Birdie had tactfully retired to her room, giving them privacy, Tara and Jay sat on the porch watching fireflies blink in darkness, like stars that had fallen to earth. Close but not touching, present but not presuming, existing in the comfortable space they'd carved out between past hurt and future possibility. "They love you," she said quietly, voice barely above whisper. "I love them. More than I knew was possible to love anything. They've taught me what actually matters. They're going to ask why you're here eventually. Why you spend so much time with us. Why you're always around but don't live with us. What do you want me to say when they ask?" He needed to know her boundaries, her comfort level, her readiness to name what was building between them. She was quiet for a long time, so long he thought maybe she wouldn't answer. Fireflies blinked in the darkness. Somewhere a dog barked. The world continued its normal rhythm while they sat in their complicated present, trying to figure out their impossible future. "The truth," she said finally, "when the time is right, but gentle. They deserve gentle truth, not harsh reality. I can do gentle. I'm learning how. Can you?" She looked at him directly now, eyes serious in dim porch light. "Because the man I knew years ago didn't have gentle in him. Had brilliant and driven and successful, but not gentle, not soft, not careful with fragile things. I'm learning from them, from you, from the way Tiger charges into everything without fear, and George approaches the world carefully, but completely. From the way you love them without conditions or expectations. From watching what actually matters instead of what I thought mattered when I was building things that looked impressive but felt empty." She smiled slightly, small curve of lips that felt like progress, like maybe the walls were lowering enough to see what could grow between them. "You've changed. I'm trying to every single day." "No," her voice was firm, certain. "You have." Past tense. The man who ran into fire twice, who shows up every week without fail, who learns to cook terrible food because his sons need dinner, that man is fundamentally different from who you were. He wanted to kiss her right then. Wanted to close the small distance between them and taste her lips and feel her warmth against him. Wanted it so badly his hands shook with restraint, But he stayed still, gave her space, let her set every boundary because that's what she needed and what he owed her after years of taking without asking. "I should go," he said instead. "It's late and you need rest." She nodded, but didn't stand immediately, just sat there looking at him in the darkness. "Thank you for helping with homework, for staying for dinner, for being patient with all of this messiness. Thank you for letting me, for giving me another chance I don't deserve but desperately need." He stood to leave, made it to the porch steps before her voice stopped him. "Jay?" He turned back, hopeful and terrified in equal measure. "Keep showing up. Keep being who you are now instead of who you were. That's all I need to see." 2 words that meant everything. Permission to continue. Acknowledgement that his efforts mattered and were being noticed. Suggestion that maybe, possibly, eventually something more could grow from these careful moments they were building together, like constructing something from scattered pieces. He drove to his rental cottage, feeling lighter than he had in years of carrying guilt. The place was still mostly empty, just a bed, table, chairs, the bare minimum for existence. But it felt less lonely than the penthouse had, with all its expensive furniture and designer touches. Because this emptiness was temporary by choice rather than consequence, was space waiting to be filled with better things if he earned the right to fill it. Some people thought he'd lost his mind walking away from his old life. Others whispered about breakdown, or early retirement, or midlife crisis. Let them think whatever they wanted. He'd found something more valuable than wealth, more important than power, more real than anything he'd built in years of trying to prove he was worth something to a world that didn't care. He'd found his family. And this time he wasn't letting go. This time he was showing up every single day, no matter what. This time he was choosing love over fear, presence over protection, vulnerability over the armor that had kept him safe but alone. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Chapter 9. The weight of what-if weeks became months in the way time passes when you're not paying attention. Summer arrived with heat that made the boys wild and energetic, chasing each other through sprinklers while adults watched from porch shade. Jay's cottage slowly filled with evidence of life actually being lived. Dishes in the sink because he'd cooked breakfast, books on shelves he'd actually read. Photos of the boys hung with pride, despite their amateur quality. His hands healed gradually, but scars remained, pale lines across his palms that the boys traced with curious fingers, that Tara looked at when she thought he wasn't watching. Physical proof that some things were worth burning for. The town had absorbed him completely now, transformed him from outsider to neighbor through months of consistent presence. Nobody called him the fancy stranger anymore. Just Jay, who helped at the community center without being asked, who coached kids' soccer despite knowing nothing about the sport, who could be counted on to show up when someone needed an extra pair of hands. He belonged here in a way he'd never belonged anywhere, not in foster homes, not in the city that celebrated his success without knowing him, not in the penthouse designed to his specifications. This small town with its gossip and potlucks had given him something money couldn't buy: genuine community, real connection, acceptance without conditions. His relationship with Tara evolved in slow increments, like ice melting, like seasons changing. She touched his arm sometimes when making a point, let their conversations extend past necessary into genuine sharing, smiled at him in ways that suggested maybe the walls were lowering enough to see what could grow between them. They hadn't discussed the future explicitly, hadn't labeled what they were beyond co-parents or friends or other inadequate terms, just existed in this careful present where he was part of their lives without being officially family, where he loved her without saying it aloud because saying it might break the fragile thing they were building. The boys asked about their father occasionally in the way children do, matter-of-factly and without drama. Tara answered honestly within age-appropriate boundaries that he was someone who'd made mistakes but was trying to fix them, who loved them even though he'd been absent at first. They accepted this with the resilience of children, more interested in who was present than who hadn't been. But Jay could feel the question building toward inevitable confrontation. At some point, they'd want real answers. At some point, Tara would have to decide if he'd earned the right to be called their father publicly. At some point, everything would have to move forward or end completely. Then came the Harvest Festival, the town's biggest event of the year. Tara agreed they should go together, all four of them. The first time they'd attended something as what could pass for a family unit in public, where everyone would see and draw conclusions. The boys were vibrating with excitement from the moment they woke up. Tiger wore his favorite dinosaur shirt, already stained from breakfast. George brought 3 special rocks in his pocket for good luck. They held hands between adults as they walked toward Town Square, swinging their arms, chattering about the games and food they'd been promised. Jay felt nervous in a way professional presentations had never made him. This felt important in ways that mattered beyond money or success. Public, like declaring something that couldn't be undeclared. But Tara seemed comfortable, smiled at him over the boys' heads with genuine warmth. The festival was exactly what small towns did best, authentic joy without pretense, simple pleasures without complications. People greeted them warmly without judgment, commented on how the boys had grown, how nice it was to see Tara smiling again, made no judgment about the complicated history everyone knew through gossip. Tiger got his face painted as a tiger because of course he did. George chose stars scattered across his cheeks. They ate corn dogs and cotton candy and got thoroughly sticky, while adults trailed behind with napkins and patient acceptance of childhood mess. Music started as the sun began its descent, painting everything golden, local band playing covers of country songs everyone knew by heart. People danced in the street without self-consciousness, without needing fancy venues or permission. Just community gathering to celebrate being alive together. Tiger grabbed his mother's hand with sticky fingers. Dance with Dad. The word hung in the air like thunder before lightning. Dad, he'd said it so casually, so naturally, like it was obvious rather than unspoken and complicated. George nodded enthusiastically, clearly thinking the same thing. Tara looked at Jay with an expression he couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but also something else. Fear, maybe? Possibility? He extended his hand carefully, palm up, giving her the choice to accept or refuse. She took it without hesitation this time. Her palm fit against his like remembering, like coming home. They moved to the music awkwardly at first, both hyper-aware of eyes watching, of children grinning with satisfaction, of the weight of this moment they were creating in front of the entire town. The song was slow, simple, something about love lasting and second chances mattering. They swayed more than danced. Tara's head came to rest against his shoulder naturally, like her body remembered even if her heart was still deciding. "They called you Dad," she whispered against his shirt. I heard. His voice was tight with emotion, barely contained. "Is that okay?" "Should I correct them?" "It's more than okay. It's everything I want, but didn't think I deserved to be called." The song ended too soon, but Jay didn't release her hand immediately, couldn't quite make himself let go of this connection they'd finally re-established. His heart was hammering against his ribs. Everything he'd been holding back for months pressed against his chest, demanding release. He'd been patient beyond what he thought himself capable of, and suddenly waiting felt impossible. The next song started, something upbeat that broke the spell. The moment was passing, and if he didn't act now, he might not find courage again. He stepped back deliberately, dropped to his knees in the middle of Main Street before he could second-guess the decision. The music stopped like someone had cut power. Conversations faded into silence. The boys rushed forward, confused but excited, sensing something important was happening. "I built everything. Without you, I built nothing." He pulled a ring from his pocket. Simple silver band he'd bought weeks ago and carried everywhere. No diamond because diamonds felt like trying to buy forgiveness. Just metal engraved with 3 small stars, representing the family he wanted to claim if she'd let him. Tears were streaming down his face without permission or apology. He didn't care who saw. Pride had destroyed him once. Vulnerability might save him now. I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm not even asking you to trust me completely yet. I'm asking you to let me spend the rest of my life proving I've changed, that I can be the man you needed me to be years ago, when I failed you. Tiger and George wrapped arms around his neck from behind, crushing him in an awkward three-way hug. Tiger shouted at his mother with all the subtlety of young children, "Say yes, Mama. Say yes." George just whispered please with heartbreaking earnestness. The crowd held its breath collectively. Tara stood frozen with her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Emotions playing across her features too fast to name. Fear, hope, pain, possibility, all warring for dominance. The ring trembled in his scarred hand, catching festival lights. He was completely vulnerable, completely exposed, kneeling in front of the entire town with everything he felt visible on his face. No protection, no armor, no walls. "I love you," he said, voice breaking on each word. "I never stopped. I was just too broken to know what to do with it, too scared to believe it could last. But I'm not that man anymore. I've learned what matters. I've learned that love is worth fighting for, even when you're terrified." She opened her mouth to speak. His phone rang suddenly, cosmic joke of timing. He pulled it out reflexively, saw his assistant's name, declined the call without looking away from Tara's face, because nothing was more important than this moment. It rang again immediately, insistent. Someone in the crowd laughed nervously. The moment was fracturing. "Answer it," Tara said quietly, testing him one more time. He shook his head with certainty. "Nothing is more important than this. Than you, than us, than this family we could build if you'll just give me the chance." The phone rang a third time. Tara stepped forward quickly, took it from his hand, answered with voice that shook but stayed strong. "This is Tara Allen. Mr. Underhill is busy. Whatever emergency you think you have, it can wait. He's exactly where he needs to be." She hung up decisively, dropped the phone on the ground. The small rebellion felt enormous. "I don't want the CEO," she said loudly enough for the whole town to hear. "I don't want the empire or the money or the man in the tower who put work before everything." His face started to crumple, preparing for rejection. "I want the man who burned his hands saving our sons without thinking twice. I want the man who makes terrible pancakes every Wednesday. I want the man kneeling in the street, crying because he finally figured out what matters more than success." Hope flickered dangerously in his chest. Tiger and George were practically vibrating with excitement. "But I need to know something first," Tara continued, voice breaking now with emotion. "And I need the truth. If I say yes right now, if I take this risk, I need to know you won't disappear when things get hard. Because they will get hard. So I need to know that when it does, you won't choose your work over us. Won't make a second priority again." He was still on his knees, still holding the ring, still crying. "I'll sell every company if that's what it takes. I'll burn the whole empire down to ashes. None of it means anything without you. Without them. Without this chance to be the father and partner I should have been from the beginning." Tiger tugged his mother's dress insistently. "Mama, why are you crying? Is it happy crying or sad crying?" She looked down at her sons with faces full of hope, then at the man who'd given them to her, who'd abandoned her, who'd come back, who'd stayed through months of proving himself, who was kneeling in front of everyone they knew, begging for another chance. Looked at the town watching with sympathy and support, at the moment stretching impossibly long, at the choice that would define everything that came next. She was terrified. You could see it in her face, in the way her hands shook, in the tears streaming faster now. Terrified of believing again, of opening her heart to someone who'd shattered it, of choosing hope over hard-won safety. But she was also brave, had survived alone when survival seemed impossible, had built a life from nothing, had learned she was strong enough to risk being hurt if the potential reward was worth it. She closed her eyes, took a breath that looked like jumping off a cliff into unknown water. The whole town waited. Jay waited, kneeling. The boys waited, pressed against them both. Her eyes opened slowly, met his, held them with intensity that made the rest of the world disappear. And her mouth opened to deliver the answer that would change everything. The word that would reshape their entire future. The decision that would either repair what was broken or confirm it was destroyed beyond recovery. Chapter 10. The beginning after the end. The word floated out barely audible, but everyone heard it. Yes, the town erupted. Applause, whistles, strangers embracing other strangers in shared joy at witnessing love winning despite odds. The band started playing again. Someone's grandmother openly wept happy tears. But Jay heard none of it. Just saw Tara's lips forming that single syllable. Just felt the boys crushing him in celebration. Just experienced the overwhelming relief of acceptance after months of proving himself worthy. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't cooperate, shaking too badly. Tara dropped to her knees with him instead, cupped his face in hands that trembled, and said it again, louder with certainty. Yes, you infuriating, broken, beautiful man who finally learned what matters. Yes. Tiger and George dogpiled them both, shrieking with delight they didn't fully understand but felt completely. People danced around them, the celebration expanding beyond their small moment into community-wide festivity. Someone started a chant of congratulations that spread through the crowd. Jay slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. It fit perfectly despite never being measured. Simple silver catching festival lights, 3 stars winking with reflected glow. Not expensive or flashy, just real and chosen deliberately for meaning rather than cost. They walked home eventually through town, still celebrating behind them. The boys fell asleep holding hands on Birdie's couch, exhausted by excitement. Tara and Jay sat in comfortable silence, not discussing what came next, just existing in the peaceful present they'd earned through patience and work. Morning arrived with reality filtering back slowly. Tara insisted he needed to handle his responsibilities properly, rather than just abandoning everything. 3 weeks to close that chapter completely, to build the foundation for their new beginning. The city felt foreign when he returned. The remaining work was handled efficiently, promoting trusted people, selling what couldn't be managed remotely, keeping only what let him stay where he belonged. His colleagues thought he'd lost his mind. He knew he'd finally found it. The wealth remained, but meant nothing compared to what mattered. He packed years into boxes and realized how little he actually needed. 1 photo, some drawings, a coffee mug. Everything else was just stuff taking up space that should be filled with better things. Tara met him at the bus station when he returned. He had 2 suitcases and a laptop bag. "Everything important, that's it?" she asked. "That's everything that matters." They didn't rush the wedding. Spent months in counseling, working through years of hurt. Some sessions were brutal, but they kept showing up, kept trying, kept choosing to fight for what they were building. The boys adjusted to calling him Dad with growing confidence. Each time he heard it, something healed. His sons, his family, his home. 6 months later, they set a wedding date. Small ceremony, garden behind the rebuilt cafe, guests who actually mattered. Tara made invitations by hand. The town helped with everything else. Wedding morning arrived clear and perfect. Tiger dropped the rings halfway down the aisle. George froze with stage fright until Tara smiled. The judge kept it short and personal. Vows were simple. Jay promised presence, not perfection. Tara promised forward motion, not forgetting. They exchanged rings engraved with matching stars, kissed while the boys cheered. The reception was beautiful chaos, potluck food, local band, children everywhere. Jay danced with Tara, with neighbors, with Birdie who whispered that he'd done good. Tiger and George stole cake. Everything was perfectly imperfect. As sun set, Jay and Tara slipped away briefly, stood at the garden's edge, watching their wedding continue. "We really did it," Tara said, leaning against him. "We really did." She traced scars on his hands. These don't hurt anymore? No, they remind me what matters. The next morning, Tiger and George arrived early with Birdie. They were helping make pancakes, which meant flour everywhere and eggs on the floor. George spotted him first. "Dad, we're making breakfast!" Tara grinned through batter. "We're all terrible at pancakes. It's a family tradition." Jay joined them, kissed his wife, hugged his sons. They made the worst pancakes and ate them, declaring them perfect. After breakfast, they piled on the couch, watching cartoons, until everyone fell asleep except Jay. He stayed awake, looking at his family. These people had saved him from himself. Tara stirred, opened one eye. "What are you thinking?" He looked at Tiger's messy hair, George's small hand gripping his shirt, Tara's head on his shoulder. "That I finally understand what empire really means." "The greatest empire is the one that fits in your arms." She smiled, closed her eyes. "Took you long enough." Outside, the world continued spinning. Inside, Jay Underhill finally came home.